The quiet storm. The Missouri countryside stretched endlessly under the golden hues of the setting sun, painting a serene picture of rolling fields and quiet roads, a place where the air was thick with the scent of grass, gasoline, and hard work. Daniel Hayes maneuvered his aging semi-truck into the lot of a small truck stop, the rumble of the engine fading as he shut it off. It was a ritual for him, a break in the monotony of long hauls that had become his new normal. Daniel, a retired Army engineer, lived a life of precision and discipline. After 20 years of service, his meticulous nature hadn't dulled. Every movement was calculated, every action deliberate. As he stepped out of his truck, the creak of the door was a small reminder of the miles the rig had endured alongside him. His eyes, sharp and discerning, scanned the lot instinctively, a habit honed over decades in the field. The truck stop was a quiet oasis, a sanctuary for weary drivers, its peeling paint and flickering neon signed testament to its age. The convenience store inside offered coffee strong enough to jolt even the most tired traveler, and the pumps outside served as the lifeline for rigs like Daniel's. But today, the air felt heavier, charged with an energy that set his instincts on edge. From the distance came the growl of motorcycle engines. The sound rolled across the open fields like a warning, growing louder as the bikers approached. Daniel straightened, his sharp eyes narrowing as he spotted the source of the noise. A gang of 5 riders on gleaming bikes roared into the lot, their presence loud and unapologetic. The group dismounted, their laughter slicing through the peaceful ambience. At the head of the pack was a hulking figure who exuded authority. Triefer Tank Mason, the gang's leader. His leather vest bore the insignia of their group, the Steel Vipers, a name whispered with equal parts fear and disdain in towns like this. Tank's bald head glistened under the fading sunlight, and his towering stature demanded attention. "Look at this dump," Tank sneered, his voice carrying through the lot. What a sorry excuse for a pit stop. The others followed his lead, mocking the small crowd of truckers and workers who had been minding their own business. The group was a kaleidoscope of chaos. Johnny Slick Harper, with his perpetual smirk and fast-talking nature. Darla Red Carson, with her fiery hair and sharper attitude. Big Joe, whose sheer size turned heads, and Pete Chains Riley, the quiet shadow whose silence was more unsettling than words. Daniel kept his gaze focused on his task, ignoring their boisterous entrance. He wasn't one to get involved in unnecessary conflicts, especially with groups like this. His hands worked methodically, filling his tank with diesel as the gang's antics escalated. The bikers were like predators in search of prey, their laughter carrying a sinister undertone that spoke of arrogance and a love for intimidation. "Hey, old-timer," Slick called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "That heap of junk yours looks like it's been through a war." Daniel ignored him, his military discipline preventing any outward reaction. He focused on the pump, the rhythmic sound of fuel flowing into the tank a steady counter to the chaos around him. But ignoring them only seemed to embolden Slick. "Don't think he heard you," Red chimed in, her tone mocking. "Maybe he's too busy trying to remember how to use that thing." The gang burst into laughter, the sound grating against Daniel's nerves. Still, he remained silent, finishing the fueling process with practiced efficiency. But then Slick, always eager to provoke, strode up to the rig and delivered a swift kick to one of the tires. The dull thud echoed across the lot. "Bet this thing doesn't even run half the time," Slick said with a smirk. Daniel's hand paused over the pump, his grip tightening imperceptibly. Years of military service had taught him restraint, the ability to assess and respond only when necessary. But the gang wasn't done yet. Tank approached, his heavy boots thudding against the concrete, his presence a looming shadow over Daniel. "You don't talk much, do you?" Tank said, his voice low and threatening. "That's fine. We can make enough noise for the both of us." As Tank leaned in closer, one of the others, the wiry, tattooed figure of Pete Chains Riley, produced a knife. Without a word, he dragged the blade across the side of Daniel's truck, leaving a deep, jagged scratch in the paint. The sound was like nails on a chalkboard, drawing the attention of everyone in the lot. The world seemed to pause. Daniel's jaw tightened, his steel blue eyes locking onto Chain's with a cold intensity. The quiet resolve in his gaze was a stark contrast to the gang's bravado. When he spoke, his voice was low but carried the weight of authority that years in the military had instilled in him. "You're going to pay for that," he said. Tank laughed, a deep guttural sound that echoed through the lot. "Pay for it? You think we're scared of you? This rust bucket isn't worth half of what my bike costs." The gang closed in, their smug smiles reflecting their belief that they held all the power. They were used to bullying people into submission, their size and numbers making them feel invincible. But Daniel wasn't like the others they had intimidated before. "Walk away," Daniel said, his tone calm but laced with a warning. "This is your only chance." The laughter stopped, replaced by a tension that hung heavy in the air. Tank sneered, stepping closer until he was inches from Daniel's face. "Or what?" Daniel's gaze never wavered. He didn't need to boast or make threats. The quiet confidence in his demeanor was enough to unnerve even the boldest of men. But Tank, blinded by arrogance, didn't see it. "All right, boys," Tank said, his grin returning. "Let's teach this guy a lesson." As the gang moved to surround him, Daniel's mind shifted gears. The years he had spent as an Army engineer came rushing back. Every lesson, every strategy, every moment of calculated action. He had been trained to handle chaos, to remain calm under pressure, and to find solutions in the most desperate of situations. This wasn't just a fight. This was a battle, and Daniel Hayes was no stranger to battle. The storm was coming, and the Steel Vipers had no idea what they had just unleashed. The calm before the tempest. The stillness before a storm is deceptive, a false sense of peace masking the chaos that's about to erupt. That's what the truck stop felt like in those tense moments as Daniel Hayes stood unmoving, his sharp eyes fixed on the gang that surrounded him. The Steel Vipers, a pack of 5 arrogant predators, fed off intimidation and control. But Daniel, with decades of experience and a life forged in discipline and resilience, was not an easy target. The leader, Trevor "Tank" Mason, towered over Daniel, his face a sneer of mockery and confidence. Around him, Johnny "Slick" Harper, Darla "Red" Carson, Big Joe, and Pete "Chains" Riley circled like sharks scenting blood. The tension in the air was palpable. The quiet onlookers at the truck stopped too afraid to intervene. They were used to the bikers running roughshod over anyone who crossed their path. What they didn't know was that Daniel Hayes wasn't someone you crossed lightly. Tank cracked his knuckles, the sound like gunshots in the stillness. "So, old man," he growled, "you gonna pay for standing in our way, or do we have to make an example out of you?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he surveyed the group, his military-honed instincts taking over. His sharp gaze picked apart their strengths and weaknesses. Tank's size was imposing but would slow him down. Slick's quick mouth would likely translate to quick movements. Red's fiery attitude would make her unpredictable. Big Joe's sheer mass would make him difficult to handle head-on. And Chains, silent, observant, and lethal, was the wild card. Daniel's pulse remained steady as he finally spoke, his voice calm and deliberate. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." The quiet confidence in his tone made Tank falter for a brief moment, but arrogance quickly replaced the hesitation. "Oh, we know exactly who we're dealing with," Tank said, smirking. "A washed-up trucker who thinks he's tougher than he is." Slick chuckled, stepping forward with a sneer. "Maybe he's one of those Army types. What do you think, Red? You think the old man's still got some fight left?" Red crossed her arms and grinned. Only one way to find out. Daniel didn't move, his calm demeanor unsettling even to the gang. He took a deep breath, his years of training kicking in. He wasn't just a retired Army engineer. He was a man who had built and deconstructed chaos, a man who knew how to turn a disadvantage into an advantage. And he knew one thing for sure. They had underestimated him. The first move. It was Slick who struck first, lunging toward Daniel with a speed that belied his wiry frame. But Daniel was ready. With a quick sidestep, he avoided the attack, using Slick's momentum against him. Slick stumbled forward, his smirk replaced by a look of surprise as Daniel caught him by the collar and twisted, sending him crashing to the ground with a loud thud. The other bikers froze for a split second, taken aback by the swift and calculated move. But the moment of hesitation was brief. Tank roared, "Get him!" And the gang surged forward. Red was next, her fiery temper driving her to throw a punch at Daniel. He blocked it with ease, his hand deflecting her blow while his other hand grabbed her wrist. With a practiced twist, he disarmed her of the knife she had concealed in her jacket. Red yelped in pain as Daniel stepped back, tossing the blade out of reach. Big Joe charged like a bull, his massive frame barreling toward Daniel. This was the kind of opponent that required precision, not brute force. Daniel waited until the last second, then shifted his weight and dropped low, using Joe's momentum to send him sprawling into the side of a parked car. The impact left a dent in the vehicle and knocked the wind out of the giant biker. Tank growled in frustration, his ego bruised as his crew faltered. He lunged at Daniel, his massive fists swinging with enough force to take down a lesser man. But Daniel wasn't a lesser man. He ducked under the blow and delivered a sharp jab to Tank's ribs, following it with a calculated elbow strike to his sternum. Tank staggered, his face contorted in pain and disbelief. Chains, who had been lurking on the periphery, finally made his move. His silence had been unnerving, and now it proved dangerous. He attacked from behind, aiming to subdue Daniel with brute force. But Daniel, ever aware of his surroundings, anticipated the strike. He shifted his weight and caught Chain's arm, twisting it into a joint lock that immobilized the biker. Chains grunted in pain, his knife clattering to the ground. A tactical retreat. The fight had lasted only moments, but it was enough to send a clear message. Daniel Hayes was no ordinary trucker. The gang regrouped, their bravado replaced by confusion and anger. Slick, still on the ground, scrambled to his feet, his smirk long gone. Red cradled her wrist, glaring at Daniel with a mix of hatred and fear. Big Joe wheezed as he pulled himself upright, while Tank stood hunched, clutching his ribs. "You're gonna regret this," Tank spat, his voice venomous. "No one makes a fool of the Steel Vipers." Daniel straightened, his calm exterior unshaken. "You made the mistake of thinking I was an easy target. Walk away before this gets worse." Tank's eyes burned with fury, but even he could see the writing on the wall. They had underestimated Daniel, and continuing the fight would only lead to more humiliation. With a growl, he motioned for his gang to fall back. One by one, they retreated to their bikes, nursing their bruises and wounded pride. As the roar of their engines faded into the distance, the truck stop fell silent once more. The onlookers, who had been too terrified to intervene, began to stir. A few approached Daniel cautiously, their expressions a mix of awe and gratitude. "Are you all right?" one of the truckers asked. Daniel nodded, brushing dust off his jacket. "I'm fine. They won't be bothering anyone here again." The fallout. The fight may have ended, but Daniel knew it wasn't over. The Steel Vipers weren't the type to take a loss lying down. Their bruised egos would demand retribution, and they wouldn't stop until they felt they had restored their dominance. But Daniel wasn't afraid. He had faced far worse in his life, and he knew how to prepare for what was coming. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the truck stop returned to its usual quiet, Daniel sat in his rig, his mind working like a well-oiled machine. He began to assess his resources, making a mental inventory of the tools and supplies he had on hand. His experience as an Army engineer had taught him how to turn even the most mundane items into solutions for complex problems, and he knew that the Steel Vipers would come back, angrier and more dangerous than before. Daniel wasn't just going to defend himself. He was going to make sure that when the Steel Vipers returned, they would leave knowing they had picked the wrong man to mess with. As the stars began to dot the night sky, Daniel started his quiet preparations. The storm had passed, but the real battle was just beginning. And Daniel Hayes was ready. The engineer's resolve. The quiet of the Missouri countryside seemed almost mocking as Daniel Hayes methodically prepared for the inevitable. He knew the Steel Vipers weren't the kind of people to let humiliation go unanswered. Their retreat from the truck stop earlier was temporary, and their anger would only fester, growing into something far more dangerous. Daniel had seen men like them before, bullies driven by arrogance, fueled by revenge. Sitting in the cab of his semi-truck, Daniel's mind worked with the precision of a machine. He had spent 2 decades as an Army engineer in some of the world's harshest environments. His job wasn't about firing guns or charging into battle. It was about ensuring his unit survived and succeeded, often against impossible odds. Logistics, strategy, improvisation. These were his weapons, and he wielded them with lethal efficiency. The events of the day replayed in his mind, the sound of the knife scraping against the side of his truck, the cocky sneers of the gang, and the moment he had put them in their place. But it wasn't satisfaction he felt now. It was focus. The Vipers would return, and this time, they wouldn't come unprepared. An unlikely arsenal. Daniel climbed out of his truck and opened one of the side compartments. Inside was an assortment of tools, spare parts, and supplies, seemingly mundane items that, in the hands of a trained engineer, became an arsenal of ingenuity. He grabbed a toolbox and set it on the ground, the clink of metal echoing in the still night. He started with the basics. Wrenches, screwdrivers, pliers. They weren't weapons in the traditional sense, but Daniel had learned how to use them to dismantle threats and construct defenses. He also had access to a collection of industrial chains, bungee cords, and heavy-duty tarts. His mind raced with possibilities, each more creative than the last. Next, he turned to his rig itself. His truck was more than a means of transport. It was a fortress on wheels. The reinforced steel frame, the customized locking mechanisms, and even the weight distribution of the cargo were all things he could use to his advantage. He began inspecting the vehicle, tightening bolts, checking hydraulic lines, and reinforcing weak points. Every inch of the truck became a potential asset in the fight he knew was coming. The lay of the land. Daniel stepped back from his truck, wiping grease from his hands onto a rag. The truck stop was quiet now, its earlier patrons long gone. He walked the perimeter, studying the area like it was a battlefield. The parking lot was spacious, but littered with natural choke points. Narrow lanes between parked trucks, a few strategically placed barriers, and the convenience store itself, which could serve as cover. To the side of the lot was a drainage ditch, its slope gentle but slick with mud from recent rain. Beyond that, an overgrown field stretched into the darkness, dotted with scrubby trees and brush. Daniel filed all this information away, constructing a mental map. Every obstacle, every blind spot, every potential trap became part of his strategy. A call to an old friend. As he worked, Daniel realized he needed more information about the Steel Vipers. They were clearly organized, and their reputation preceded them. To face them properly, he needed intel. Pulling out his phone, he dialed a number he hadn't used in years. "Hayes," came the gruff voice on the other end. "It's me, Bill," Daniel said. Bill Carter was a retired MP and one of the few people Daniel trusted implicitly. They had served together in Afghanistan, where Bill's sharp instincts and knack for digging up information had saved their unit more than once. "Dan, it's been a while," Bill said, his tone softening. "What's going on?" "I've got a problem," Daniel said, explaining the encounter with the Steel Vipers and his suspicion that they'd be back. "I need to know what I'm up against." Bill let out a low whistle. "Steel Vipers, huh? They're bad news. I've heard of them. They've got a record of running roughshod over towns, shaking down businesses and leaving chaos in their wake. They're more than just a biker gang. They've got connections, resources. You sure you want to take them on? I don't have a choice, Daniel said simply. They're coming back, and I'm not running. Bill was silent for a moment, then said, "All right, I'll see what I can find. Give me a couple of hours." "Thanks, Bill. I owe you." "You don't owe me a thing, Hayes. You just stay alive." Setting the traps. By the time the call ended, Daniel's plan was already taking shape. He set to work, using the tools and materials at his disposal to transform the truck stop into a makeshift fortress. The first thing he did was rig his truck. The reinforced frame and customized locking mechanisms became the centerpiece of his defense. He installed additional latches and braced the cab's interior with steel bars, ensuring it would hold if the gang tried to breach it. Next, he turned his attention to the lot itself. Using chains and bungee cords, he set up a series of tripwires and snares, carefully concealing them in the shadows between parked vehicles. He positioned heavy barrels and crates as barriers, creating narrow choke points that would funnel the bikers into predictable paths. In the overgrown field, he used the brush to camouflage makeshift obstacles, ropes strung low to trip anyone who pursued him on foot. Finally, he turned his attention to the convenience store. The building's reinforced windows and metal doors made it a potential stronghold, but it also had vulnerabilities. Daniel used his tools to secure the back entrance and barricaded the front with shelving units. He positioned fire extinguishers near the entrances, knowing they could serve as improvised weapons in a pinch. The warning. As dawn broke, Daniel stood back and surveyed his work. The truck stop now resembled a battlefield, each element of his plan carefully placed to maximize his advantage. But he knew that preparation alone wasn't enough. He needed to send a message, a warning to the steel vipers that they were stepping into dangerous territory. Using a can of spray paint he found in the store, Daniel scrawled a message on the side of his truck, the bold letters stark against the scratched paint. "Turn back, or face the consequences." He knew the message would infuriate them. But that was the point. Anger made people reckless, and recklessness was something he could exploit. The storm approaches. As the sun climbed higher, Daniel's phone buzzed. It was Bill. "Got some intel for you," Bill said. "The Vipers are worse than I thought. They're tied to some pretty serious stuff. Extortion, assault, even a couple of disappearances. But here's the thing. They don't like losing. When they get embarrassed, they hit back hard. They'll be coming for you, Hayes, and they won't hold back." "Let them come," Daniel said, his voice steady. "I'm ready. Just be careful," Bill warned. "These guys don't fight fair." "I don't need them to," Daniel replied. "Thanks, Bill." As he ended the call, Daniel felt a sense of calm settle over him. He had faced tougher opponents in far worse conditions. The Steel Vipers thought they were the hunters, but they were walking into a trap set by a man who had spent his life outsmarting people just like them. As the hours passed and the sun began its descent, Daniel waited. The rumble of distant engines finally broke the quiet, growing louder with each passing second. The Steel Vipers were coming, and this time they were out for blood. But Daniel Hayes was ready. The ambush. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the truck stop. The quiet anticipation of the day gave way to the tense stillness of the evening. Daniel Hayes stood near his truck, his silhouette a lone figure against the sprawling lot. He had done everything he could to prepare. Now it was a waiting game. And then he heard it, the unmistakable growl of motorcycle engines in the distance. The sound rumbled through the air like the roar of an approaching storm. Daniel tightened his grip on the wrench in his hand, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon. He wasn't nervous, he was focused. This wasn't just about survival, it was about sending a message. The arrival. The Steel Vipers rolled in like a thunderstorm, their roaring engines cutting through the quiet night. Their headlights illuminated the lot, casting long, ominous beams across the parked trucks. Trevor Tank Mason led the charge, his massive frame hulking over the handlebars of his custom bike. Behind him, Slick, Red, Big Joe, and Chains fanned out, their faces hardened with determination and rage. Tank brought his bike to a halt and dismounted, his boots hitting the ground with a heavy thud. He looked around the lot, his sharp eyes scanning for Daniel. When he saw the message scrawled on the side of the truck, "TURN back," or "FACE," the CONSEQUENCES, his jaw tightened and a guttural laugh escaped his lips. Well, Tank said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Looks like the old man wants to play." The gang laughed, their arrogance palpable. They didn't see the carefully laid traps, the subtle preparations that transformed the truck stop into a battlefield. They only saw a lone trucker standing in defiance of their wrath. "Where is he?" Slick called out, his smirk returning. "Simon, soldier boy, let's see what you're made of." Daniel stepped forward, his movements deliberate and calm. He stopped a few feet away from the gang, his steel blue eyes locking onto Tank's. "You were warned," Daniel said simply. Tank snorted, his laughter echoing through the lot. "Warned? You think a little paint is gonna scare us? You've got guts, I'll give you that. But guts don't count for much when you're outnumbered." Daniel didn't respond. He didn't need to. Instead, he shifted his weight slightly, his stance relaxed but ready. The gang didn't realize it yet, but the fight had already begun. The first strike. Slick, always eager to prove himself, was the first to move. He charged toward Daniel, a crowbar in hand, his grin widening as he prepared to strike. But Daniel was ready. As Slick swung, Daniel ducked and sidestepped, grabbing the younger man's arm and twisting it. The crowbar clattered to the ground as Slick yelped in pain. Before the rest of the gang could react, Daniel shoved Slick backward into a strategically placed tripwire. The wiry biker fell hard, landing with a loud thud as the others stared in stunned silence. "You son of a..." Tank growled, but Daniel cut him off. "Next," Daniel said, his voice calm and steady. "The trap spring." Red was next, her fiery temper driving her forward with reckless abandon. She swung a chain at Daniel, the metal links whistling through the air. But Daniel anticipated her move. He grabbed a heavy tarp he had secured earlier and used it to deflect the chain, wrapping it around the weapon and pulling it from her grasp. Red stumbled, unprepared for the counter, and Daniel delivered a swift kick that sent her sprawling into a stack of barrels. Big Joe and Chains moved in tandem, their sheer size and strength meant to overpower Daniel. But Daniel wasn't about to let them dictate the fight. As they approached, he triggered another trap, a hidden snare made of industrial bungee cords. The cords snapped into place, tangling Joe's legs and pulling him off balance. Chains avoided the trap, but found himself facing Daniel head-on. Chains lunged with a knife, his movements quick and calculated. But Daniel had been studying him all evening. He sidestepped the attack and used a nearby wrench to disarm Chains with a sharp, precise strike. The knife clattered to the ground, and Daniel followed up with an elbow to Chains' jaw, sending the silent biker reeling. Tank's fury. Tank watched as his gang faltered, his fury growing with each passing second. He had underestimated Daniel once, and he wasn't about to make that mistake again. With a roar, he charged forward, his massive fists swinging like sledgehammers. Daniel braced himself, knowing that Tank's strength was his greatest asset and his greatest weakness. The biker leader's swings were powerful but slow, telegraphed by his sheer size. Daniel dodged the first punch, then the second, his movements fluid and controlled. He waited for the right moment, then delivered a sharp jab to Tank's side, aiming for the ribs he had injured earlier. Tank grunted in pain but didn't slow down. He swung again, this time catching Daniel off guard. The blow glanced off Daniel's shoulder, the force sending him stumbling backward. Tank advanced, his face twisted with rage. "You think you're smart, huh?" Tank growled. "Think you're better than us?" Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he reached for one of the fire extinguishers he had strategically placed earlier. As Tank lunged, Daniel triggered the extinguisher, releasing a blinding cloud of foam directly into the biker's face. Tank roared in frustration, swinging wildly as he tried to wipe the foam from his eyes. Daniel used the distraction to his advantage. He delivered a powerful kick to Tank's knee, forcing the giant biker to the ground. Tank let out a pained yell, his bravado crumbling under the weight of Daniel's relentless precision. The gang retreats. The rest of the gang, battered and humiliated, began to retreat. Slick, still tangled in the tripwire, scrambled to his feet and limped toward his bike. Red clutched her bruised wrist, her fiery attitude now tempered by fear. Big Joe and Chains helped each other up, their eyes wary as they backed away from Daniel. Tank, still kneeling on the ground, glared up at Daniel with unbridled hatred. "This isn't over," he spat. Daniel leaned in close, his voice low and steady. "Yes, it is. Next time you come near me, or anyone else, you won't walk away." Tank hesitated, the weight of Daniel's words sinking in. Finally, he signaled to his gang, and they mounted their bikes. The roar of their engines filled the air once more as they sped away into the night, their defeat etched into their expressions. A quiet victory. As the noise faded, the truck stop fell silent again. Daniel stood alone in the lot, his shoulders relaxing for the first time in hours. He looked around at the aftermath, the fallen barrels, the scattered tools, the evidence of a battle hard fought and won. The few patrons who had stayed hidden during the fight began to emerge, their expressions a mix of awe and gratitude. One of the truckers approached Daniel hesitantly. "That was incredible," the man said. "You really took them down." Daniel shrugged, his demeanor humble. "Just did what needed to be done." The trucker nodded, then added, "I don't think they'll be back after this." "Let's hope not," Daniel replied, his voice quiet but resolute. He knew the Steel Vipers might not forget this humiliation, but he also knew they would think twice before crossing him, or anyone else, in the future. As he climbed back into his truck, Daniel allowed himself a small smile. The fight was over, and for now, the road ahead was clear, but he would always be ready for whatever came next. That was who he was, a man of quiet strength, unshakable resolve, and a lifetime of lessons in how to survive. The counteroffensive. The Steel Viper's retreat left the truck stop in eerie silence, broken only by the distant hum of engines fading into the night. Daniel Hayes leaned against his semi-truck, his sharp eyes scanning the lot one last time. Though the fight had ended, his instincts told him this wasn't over. The gang had slunk away bruised and battered, but men like Tank and his crew didn't let humiliation go unanswered. Daniel knew they would regroup, plot, and come back stronger. For now, though, he allowed himself a moment of respite. He retrieved a bottle of water from his cab, taking a long sip as he assessed the aftermath. The tripwires, snares, and barricades had served their purpose, but the damage to the truck stop was evident. Scattered debris, toppled barrels, and faint scorch marks from a small fire created a chaotic scene. One of the truck stop workers approached cautiously, his wide eyes betraying a mix of awe and unease. "Hey, mister. That was something else. I've never seen anyone handle those guys like that." Daniel nodded but kept his expression neutral. "They'll be back. Make sure you and your people stay clear if they do." The worker hesitated before replying. "What are you going to do?" Daniel's response was measured. "What I have to. A midnight plan." As the worker retreated, Daniel climbed into his cab and started the engine. The familiar rumble filled the air as he eased the truck out of its parking spot and headed for the highway. He had no intention of waiting passively for the Steel Vipers to regroup. They had crossed a line, and he knew the best defense was often a calculated offense. The truck hummed steadily as Daniel navigated the darkened roads. His destination wasn't far, a sprawling salvage yard just outside town. It was a place he had visited often, both to scavenge parts for his rig and to barter with the grizzled owner, Jake Logan, a retired mechanic with a knack for acquiring the unusual. The salvage yard loomed ahead, its silhouette jagged and chaotic under the moonlight. Daniel pulled up to the gate and gave it a firm knock. A few moments later, Jake emerged from a makeshift office, his grease-streaked face breaking into a grin when he recognized Daniel. "Well, if it isn't Hayes," Jake said, his voice gruff but friendly. "What brings you here at this hour?" "I need some supplies," Daniel replied, his tone all business. "And fast." Jake raised an eyebrow but didn't press for details. "Come on in. Let's see what I've got." Building the arsenal. Inside the yard, Daniel sifted through piles of scrap and machinery with a practiced eye. He wasn't looking for standard tools. He needed materials he could turn into weapons, defenses, and diversions. As he worked, Jake watched with quiet curiosity. "You're not just fixing up your truck, are you?" Jake finally asked, leaning against a rusted chassis. Daniel paused, debating how much to share. "Had a run-in with some bikers. They'll be back." Jake let out a low whistle. "Steel Vipers?" Daniel nodded. "Well, hell," Jake said, shaking his head. "You're gonna need more than duct tape and elbow grease to deal with them." Daniel's lips quirked into a faint smile. "That's why I'm here." Over the next hour, Daniel loaded his truck with an assortment of items, lengths of rebar, heavy-duty chains, spare batteries, and even a pair of old propane tanks. Each piece had a purpose, though its use wasn't immediately obvious to an untrained eye. Jake didn't ask questions, but as Daniel prepared to leave, he placed a hand on his shoulder. "Be careful out there," Jake said, his voice uncharacteristically serious. "Those guys don't play fair." "I don't either," Daniel replied, his tone calm but resolute. The Vipers regroup. Meanwhile, at a desolate roadhouse on the outskirts of town, the Steel Vipers nursed their wounds and plotted their revenge. Tank sat at a scared wooden table, his massive fists clenched as he glared at his crew. "This isn't over," Tank growled, his voice a low rumble. "That trucker made fools of us, and we're not leaving until he pays." Slick, his arm wrapped in a makeshift sling, scowled. "That guy's no ordinary trucker. He's military. You saw how he fought. Calculated, precise. We underestimated him." Tank slammed a fist on the table, causing the glasses to rattle. "I don't care if he's the damn president. He's one man, and we're five. Next time, we hit him hard and fast. No games." Red leaned forward, her eyes burning with intensity. "We need to know his weaknesses. He's tough, but everyone has a breaking point." Chains, silent as ever, nodded in agreement. Big Joe cracked his knuckles, his bruised face set in grim determination. They began laying out their plan, each of them eager to reclaim their dominance. Preparation and anticipation. Back at the truck stop, Daniel worked tirelessly through the night. His rig, already a fortress on wheels, was now a machine of ingenuity and precision. He reinforced the cab with steel plating scavenged from the salvage yard, turning it into an impenetrable stronghold. The rebar and chains were fashioned into makeshift barricades, designed to immobilize pursuing vehicles. The propane tanks became part of an improvised trap, rigged to detonate if tampered with. Using spare batteries and salvaged wiring, Daniel crafted a series of flashbang devices, their purpose to disorient and confuse. Every piece of his plan was calculated, every tool a means to level the playing field. By the time dawn broke, the truck stop looked quiet, almost peaceful. But beneath its surface was a labyrinth of traps and defenses, each one meticulously designed to neutralize the Steel Vipers. The final push. As Daniel stood by his truck, the first rays of sunlight cutting through the horizon, he heard the distant rumble of engines. They were coming, just as he knew they would. But this time, he was ready. The Steel Vipers roared into the lot, their presence as menacing as ever. Tank dismounted first, his movements deliberate and predatory. Behind him, the rest of the gang spread out, their weapons gleaming in the early light. Daniel stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "You had your warning. And you're about to have your funeral," Tank shot back, his voice dripping with venom. The gang began to close in, their confidence bolstered by their numbers. But as they moved, the first trap sprung. A hidden tripwire sent Slick sprawling to the ground, his weapon skittering out of reach. Before he could recover, a flashbang detonated, filling the air with blinding light and deafening noise. Chaos erupted. Red charged forward, but Daniel anticipated her movements. A barricade of rebar and chains blocked her path, forcing her into the open where she was an easy target. Big Joe roared as he tried to muscle through a makeshift barricade, only to find himself caught in another tripwire that sent him crashing to the ground. Tank, furious and unrelenting, led the charge toward Daniel's truck. But as he reached the cab, a warning click stopped him in his tracks. The propane tanks, rigged to detonate, stood between him and his target. Tank froze, realizing too late that the battle was already lost. Daniel stepped forward, his calm demeanor unshaken. "This ends here. Walk away, and you'll leave with your lives." Tank's fists clenched, but the weight of his defeat was undeniable. Slowly, he signaled to his gang. One by one, they retreated, their arrogance shattered. Aftermath. As the steel vipers disappeared into the distance, the truck stop fell silent once more. Daniel leaned against his truck, his body tired but his resolve unbroken. The patrons who had stayed hidden during the chaos began to emerge, their faces a mix of relief and admiration. "Thank you," one of them said, their voice trembling. "You saved us." Daniel nodded but said nothing. This wasn't about heroism. It was about doing what needed to be done. As he climbed back into his cab, the weight of the night settled over him. The road ahead was long, but he knew he was ready for whatever came next. He always had been. The reckoning. The sun climbed higher into the sky, bathing the truck stop in golden light. The quiet seemed almost surreal after the chaos of the previous night. Daniel Hayes sat in the cab of his semi-truck, his steel-blue eyes fixed on the horizon. The steel vipers were gone, for now. But Daniel knew this wasn't the end. Men like Trevor "Tank" Mason didn't retreat quietly. They regrouped, rearmed, and struck back harder. The patrons of the truck stop had expressed their gratitude, their words a mix of awe and disbelief. But Daniel wasn't looking for thanks. He wasn't a hero. He was a man doing what needed to be done. As he started his truck and pulled out of the lot, his thoughts shifted. If the vipers wouldn't stop coming, then he'd take the fight to them. A bold decision. The idea had been brewing since the moment the gang retreated. Waiting for them to strike again wasn't an option. They'd only grow bolder, more dangerous, and Daniel wouldn't allow innocent people to get caught in the crossfire. It was time to dismantle the steel vipers, completely. Daniel's first stop was his home, a modest cabin tucked away on the outskirts of town. The place was unassuming, but inside, it was a testament to his years in the military. The garage was a treasure trove of tools, equipment, and old mementos from his service. He opened a locked chest and pulled out a weathered canvas bag. Inside were items he hadn't touched in years. Tactical gear, maps, and a military-grade laptop. He spread a map of the county across his workbench and began marking known biker hangouts and routes. The Steel Vipers operated like a small militia, moving between locations and relying on intimidation to maintain control. Daniel's plan was simple: isolate them, dismantle their operations, and ensure they couldn't recover. Gathering allies. Daniel knew he couldn't do this alone. While his skills and training were formidable, the Steel Vipers had numbers and resources. He needed help, and he knew just where to find it. He made a call to Bill Carter, his old friend and retired MP. Bill had been instrumental in providing intel on the gang before, and Daniel suspected he'd be eager to do more. The phone rang twice before Bill's gruff voice answered. "Hayes, you alive?" "For now," Daniel replied. "I need your help." Bill listened as Daniel outlined his plan. There was a pause on the other end before Bill responded. "You're talking about going after an entire gang. That's not exactly subtle. They won't stop, Bill. Not unless someone makes them." Another pause, then a low chuckle. "You always did have a way of diving headfirst into trouble. All right, I'm in. I got some contacts who might be able to help. Let me make a few calls." "Thanks, Bill. I owe you." "You keep saying that," Bill said. "Just don't get yourself killed." Setting the stage. While Bill worked on rallying support, Daniel began preparing for the confrontation. His first target was the roadhouse where the gang had regrouped the night before. He scouted the location during the day, noting the layout and entry points. The place was a fortress of sorts, with heavy bikes parked out front and guards stationed at the entrance. Daniel didn't plan to attack directly. Instead, he decided to disrupt their operations subtly at first. That night, under the cover of darkness, he returned to the roadhouse with a backpack full of tools. Using his knowledge of mechanics, he sabotaged several of the gang's bikes, cutting fuel lines and tampering with ignition systems. The next morning, chaos erupted as the bikers discovered their rides were useless. It was a small victory, but it sent a message. They weren't invincible. Escalation. As Daniel continued his campaign, Bill came through with reinforcements. Two of Bill's contacts, former military buddies with specialized skills, joined the effort. Marcus, a demolitions expert, and Alina, a communications specialist, brought new layers of expertise to Daniel's plan. Together, they executed a series of precise strikes. They intercepted the gang's supply runs, disrupted their communications, and left warnings at every turn. Each attack was calculated to weaken the Vipers' hold on the region and sow fear within their ranks. But the gang wasn't idle. Tank, furious and desperate to reclaim his power, began hunting for Daniel. He unleashed his full force, sending crews to scour the countryside and intimidate anyone who might have helped the former soldier. The stakes grew higher with each passing day. The final battle. It all came to a head at an abandoned industrial site on the edge of town. The Steel Vipers, enraged and desperate, had tracked Daniel to the location, unaware that they were walking into a trap. Daniel, Marcus, and Alina had spent the previous night rigging the site with an intricate web of defenses, explosives, barriers, and escape routes. As the gang roared onto the property, Tank led the charge, his fury evident in every movement. "Hayes," he bellowed, his voice echoing through the empty buildings. "Come out and face me." Daniel stepped into the open, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the chaos around him. "You've had your warnings, Tank. This ends here." Tank laughed, a guttural sound filled with malice. "You think you can take all of us? You're just one man." Daniel didn't respond. Instead, he signaled to Marcus and Alina, who triggered the first set of explosives. The ground shook as a series of controlled detonations cut off the gang's escape routes, trapping them in the site. Panic spread through the Vipers as Daniel and his team launched their counteroffensive. Flashbangs erupted, disorienting the bikers as Daniel moved with precision, picking them off one by one. Marcus's demolitions created chaos, while Alina used a drone to track and outmaneuver the gang. Tank fought fiercely, his brute strength unmatched by any of Daniel's traps. The two men finally faced off in a brutal hand-to-hand fight. Tank's swings were wild and powerful, but Daniel's movements were calculated and controlled. With a final, well-placed blow, Daniel brought Tank to his knees. A new chapter. By dawn, the Steel Vipers were finished. Those who hadn't fled were either incapacitated or bound for the authorities, thanks to Bill's connections with local law enforcement. Tank, battered and defeated, was among the captured. As the police arrived to clean up the aftermath, Daniel stood on the edge of the site, his expression unreadable. He had won, But it wasn't about victory. It was about making things right. Marcus and Elena approached, their faces tired but triumphant. "Hell of a fight," Marcus said. "What now?" Daniel looked out at the horizon, the first rays of sunlight breaking through the clouds. "Now we go home. And we stay ready. People like this don't disappear overnight." As he climbed into his truck and started the engine, Daniel felt a sense of calm he hadn't experienced in years. The road ahead was long, but he was ready to face it, just as he always had. The Steel Vipers were no more, but the lesson they'd learned would echo far beyond their defeat. Some men, no matter how quiet or unassuming, are not to be underestimated. Daniel Hayes was one of those men. And now, the world knew it too. The aftermath of the reckoning. The morning after the final confrontation, the air was still, heavy with the scent of smoke and oil. The industrial site, once a forgotten remnant of the past, now bore the scars of a battle fought and won. The Steel Vipers, who had once terrorized the quiet Missouri countryside, were no longer a looming threat. Daniel Hayes stood among the ruins, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the rising sun. The victory was his, but it didn't come without a price. Exhaustion tugged at his limbs, the weight of the night's events etched into every muscle. Around him, the remnants of his preparations were evident. Barricades half collapsed, the smoldering remnants of makeshift traps, and the faint scorch marks from the controlled detonations. Marcus and Elena approached from the wreckage, their faces reflecting a mix of relief and grim satisfaction. Marcus, ever the optimist, cracked a tired grin as he handed Daniel a canteen of water. "Well, that was a hell of a night," Marcus said, his voice rough from the dust and smoke. "Didn't think I'd be rigging explosives in the middle of nowhere again, but here we are." Daniel took the canteen and nodded, his sharp gaze scanning the site one last time. "It's over," he said simply. "But they'll remember this." Elena, the quieter of the two, adjusted her drone pack and frowned. "What about Tank and the rest? The ones who didn't run?" "Bill's contacts will handle them," Daniel replied, his tone firm. "Law enforcement's been itching to take them down for years. Now they've got everything they need." The arrests. As Daniel predicted, the local authorities descended on the site within hours. Bill Carter had come through, using his connections to ensure the Steel Vipers faced justice. Tank and several key members of the gang were hauled away in cuffs, their battered faces a testament to the fight they had lost. The officers who arrived were a mix of local law enforcement and state troopers, their presence a stark reminder that the gang's reign of terror was over. Daniel kept his distance, standing by his truck as the police combed through the scene. One of the officers, a grizzled man in his 50s, approached him. "You're the one who called this in?" the officer asked, his sharp eyes narrowing as he studied Daniel. "Something like that," Daniel replied. The officer extended a hand. "Sheriff Carter, Bill's my cousin. He told me about you." Daniel shook his hand but said nothing. He wasn't interested in recognition or praise. The sheriff seemed to sense this and didn't press further. "You did a lot of people a favor here," Carter said. "The Vipers have been a thorn in our side for years. This should put an end to it." Daniel simply nodded. "Let's hope it sticks." Returning to normal. After the dust settled and the police cleared the site, Daniel returned to the truck stop. The place was quieter than usual, the events of the past few days leaving their mark on the locals. The staff greeted him with a mix of gratitude and curiosity, their whispered conversations filling the air. The gas station attendant, a young man with a nervous energy, approached him as he fueled up his rig. "Hey, Mr. Hayes," the kid stammered. "Thanks for what you did. I mean, those guys. They've been scaring people around here for years." Daniel gave a faint smile, but didn't linger on the praise. "Just keep your head down and stay out of trouble." The kid nodded eagerly, retreating as Daniel finished fueling. The truck stop seemed different now, quieter, safer. For the first time in days, the tension in the air had dissipated. A father's reflection. That evening, Daniel parked his truck at a scenic overlook just outside of town. The view stretched out before him, a vast expanse of rolling hills bathed in the warm hues of sunset. He sat on the hood of his truck, his thoughts drifting to his daughter, Emily. She was in college now, living a life far removed from the chaos her father had faced. But Daniel had always carried her with him, her laughter and curiosity, a constant reminder of why he fought so hard. He pulled out his phone and dialed her number. "Hey, Dad." Emily's voice was bright, a balm to his weary soul. "I didn't expect to hear from you tonight." "Just wanted to check in," Daniel said, his voice softer than usual. "How's school?" Emily launched into a detailed account of her classes, her excitement evident. Daniel listened, his lips curving into a rare smile. For a moment, the weight of the past few days faded, replaced by the simple joy of hearing his daughter's voice. "I'm proud of you, Emily," he said when she paused for breath. Her response was warm. "Thanks, Dad. I'm proud of you too." A warning heeded. In the weeks that followed, the impact of Daniel's actions rippled through the community. The Steel Vipers had been dismantled, their influence broken. Word spread quickly, and soon, the story of the trucker who stood up to the gang became local legend. But for Daniel, life returned to its steady rhythm. He resumed his hauls, moving from town to town, always watchful, always prepared. The road stretched out before him, a reminder of the freedom and solitude he cherished. The message he left behind was clear. Sometimes, the quietest men carry the most strength, and when pushed to their limits, they become a force to be reckoned with. Epilogue. The road ahead. As Daniel's truck rumbled down the highway, the night sky stretched endlessly above him. The stars seemed brighter, their light cutting through the darkness. In the rearview mirror, the faint glow of the Missouri countryside faded into the distance. For Daniel Hayes, the battle was over, but the road ahead was long. He wasn't just a trucker, a retired soldier, or a father. He was a man who had faced the worst life could throw at him and come out stronger. And as long as there were challenges to face, Daniel would meet them head-on, with quiet determination and an unshakable resolve. Some men lived for peace. Others, like Daniel, were forged by the storm, prepared to fight for what mattered most. And as the miles rolled by, one thing remained certain. Wherever Daniel Hayes went, trouble wouldn't follow for long.